What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Lions Latest, going through the latest Detroit Lions news. And today we have some injury updates to discuss. Some unfortunate news, I think, across the board here. A very significant injury that has knocked the player seemingly out for the upcoming season. One of our rookie draft picks, which really stinks. So we're going to get into that. But also, there was a clip that I heard today speaking on the Lions Hall of Fame performance from a mainstream media channel. And today I wanted to address that clip. Not because I wanted to address who said it, but more so the idea that comes from that clip, because it's something I've heard all offseason. I feel like I battled it a little bit, and today I wanted to add more fuel to that just to have some fun. But before we get to that, let's start with some of these injury and roster updates that we have. We also add a couple of new pieces as well, which is necessary with some of the guys that we have banged up. First off, the worst news here as of now, Dan Jackson being placed on the injured reserved list, which essentially shuts him down for this upcoming season. Had a leg injury, and it sounded like when Dan Campbell spoke to the media that they were getting some second and third opinions, but as of now, he's been shut down, placed on that list. Now, eventually, you could come to an injury settlement. You could then sign him again if you were able to bring him back and someone else didn't sign him, and then potentially you could have him back hypothetically during the year, but ultimately, this essentially shuts him down for this upcoming season, which really stinks. I was really impressed with his first game performance. I thought he looked super smart on the field. He looked like a guy that I would have trusted as a backup safety. I mean, it was a very small glimpse, but that's just the early sense that I had. And then going through the All-22, seeing a little bit more of the versatility, some of the man coverage he was getting utilized in. I hate this for Dan Jackson. I was very excited for him. And right now, backup safety is so up in the air. Going to add consistency there. And I thought that, as crazy as it sounded for a rookie, I thought Dan Jackson had a real shot to do that. So I hate this for him. Hoping for a speedy recovery for Dan Jackson, as it sounds like he's going to be down for the season. Also, Ennis Rakestraw in due time is what we know, according to Dan Campbell, when he could potentially be back. But it could be a while as of now, but it's in due time. They're getting him checked out. He was banged up in Sunday's practice, so I don't really have an update beyond that right now. How significant? I don't want to put any timetable on that because I really have no clue. I'm hoping it's not too serious where he's down that long. But as of now, I guess we just don't know, and we'll find out more shortly, I'm sure, with Ennis Rakestraw. But after that first performance, man, he's just been up and down, just being able to get on the field, being able to get to participate. And this is an excellent opportunity. There's 4 preseason games to get a ton of reps. So just him missing time is just at a terrible spot right now. And of course, this cornerback room is pretty darn depleted at this point, just with some of the back end pieces. We've had a lot of movement there, guys in and out, new additions, new pieces on the field. Now, I still feel pretty comfortable with this cornerback room as a whole, because DJ Reed back at practice, Terrion Arnold, sounds like we've gotten some pretty good updates there, like midweek looking. And then also with Meek Robertson, Akisin, after his first preseason game, looked pretty strong. He's kind of bouncing around doing different things in his defense. And so hopefully Khalil Dorsey as well is kind of ready around that time early this upcoming season. At this point, it does seem like it'd be really nice to get Khalil Dorsey back, and that timeline is going to be one to kind of keep an eye on here. Outside of those 2 injury updates, though, we also have the Lions waiving undrafted free agent running back Kai Robichaud, officially waived injured. Now both UDFA running backs have been waived under that same declaration. So both those guys are out. We know Sailors has recently been added to that running back room, and I thought Small did some good things within that first preseason game. On top of that, the Lions went out and made a couple of roster moves. And I'll kind of fly through this, but we have 2 new additions. First off, and I could be pronouncing these names wrong, we have DJ Miller Jr., who has been signed as really just a defensive back. He's played corner, he's played slot corner, he's played safety. Most recently at cornerback in the UFL, played for the Michigan Panthers this past season. And Dan Campbell has told us that he's really valued this because guys are typically in game shape because they're just coming off a season. And he, having played 10 games for the Michigan Panthers, a couple of takeaways as well. The Lions went out and grabbed him. When we saw him last in the NFL was in the preseason with Kansas City. We saw him last season. He played against us, and he was playing at the safety position, which I think his skill set could translate a little bit better in the NFL. But he's shown a ton of flexibility, stepping into the nickel role and some of their sub packages as well. So he's been able to play all over the field. He's a 2024 undrafted free agent from Kent State. And when I just went through and kind of got a little sense of what it looked like, I thought the big standout was he's a squatty defender, very physical in the upper body. You can see the toughness that he has there, some of the strength that he carries, also some real explosion, the plant and drive explosiveness. You can see that from a top-down safety kind of role you could throw him into. Extends his length well, seems pretty coordinated, natural ball skills. It's overall just the body control, right? Pretty balanced, did a really nice job I thought, of squeezing routes in zone coverage, closing airspace, which again is just kind of the sign of a safety. He showed range with Kansas City, being able to play a lot of their single high roles specifically, but then step into the box, play in the nickel if they wanted to, play in some of those zone responsibilities, squeeze routes, be physical, press routes. Ultimately, I didn't feel like he looked the most fluid in coverage, or maybe he had the best recovery speed or true acceleration down the field, his long speed as well. And then some of just the lateral change of direction, maybe some of the quickness could be lacking there as well. So I'm not sure exactly where he's going to be utilized, but with the Dan Jackson injury, I could see it being at safety or just kind of a mix of everywhere for this Lions defense. And then on top of that, the Lions also went out and added defensive back Luke Barku. Most recently with the Dallas Cowboys, they ended up having 5 players in for a workout. Most recently that we saw him on the field was 2023 with the Pittsburgh Steelers in the preseason. He was on a futures contract with the Steelers, then he was waived on an injury settlement, then he was ultimately on a futures contract with the Dallas Cowboys, and then he was waived there as well in June. So now he's been scooped up relatively recently here by the Detroit Lions. A little bit of an older player, 27 years old, and if you go back to that, he's a little bit more of a longer, seemingly slimmer type of cornerback, right? Kind of an upright type of style that seemingly did a really nice job with some of the long speed, staying on top of routes vertically, kind of settling into that role really nice, but having tons of physicality, willingness to step in against a run specifically, being an easy mover that was really tough against a run, had really good vision for that. Maybe some of the discipline could be hit and miss for that reason specifically, because he would get his eyes kind of out of place, but he's very light on his toes, could transition very smoothly. I want to talk about this little clip that I heard today because I just want to address it. I just want to talk about it and maybe point out some things that I don't think are necessarily fair today, and then some things that I also agreed with from this clip, and things that are going to have to be proven out as we go forward here with some of the new additions that we have. Because it's not necessarily who said the clip and like, oh, I disagree with this guy, but it's more so just the idea that was presented in this clip. So I'm going to show a few segments here, and I want to talk through it. But
it's the Hall of Fame game. The Chargers just barrel rolled the Detroit Lions. But when you watch that game, it wasn't just that the Lions lost. Everything's something, nothing's everything. They were sloppy. 5 turnovers, yet didn't create any. And sloppy is coaching and scheme and communication. And it's coordinating. And what did the Lions do?
The point is talking about how the Hall of Fame game for us was sloppy. It was a messy game, and that does matter that it was a messy game because you have the 2 new coordinators, which we're going to get into. The first thing I would say is this. I don't think the Hall of Fame game really matters to anything when you talk about what's the season going to turn into. Number one, biggest reason for that is obviously personnel that's on the field. Most players that you have on the field aren't actually even going to make the team, right? It's more so about building out, I think, the practice squad, guys that you want to keep around. Of course, your rookies will, but for us, I thought most of our rookies actually performed pretty well or up to standard that I was expecting. So for that element, I just don't think the Hall of Fame game really does mean that much. We know it doesn't mean anything in the record books, but to just add some context to that, if you look at 2 of the most recent kind of blowouts, because this was 34-7, that's considered a blowout for sure, but 2 of the most recent ones in the Hall of Fame game would be Dallas, I would say going back to 2021 when they lost 3-16 in their Hall of Fame game. That season they went 12-5, were first place in their division. Or the next season, the Jacksonville Jaguars, who in their Hall of Fame game lost 11-27, completed 50% of their passes. They turned the ball over once, forced 0 turnovers. They were down 20-0 at half in that game. They went on to win their division that season. That Dallas game, a sub 50% completion percentage, 4 sacks taken in that game, 3 turnovers offensively to only forcing 1. So both those teams had a pretty darn poor, I would say, first preseason game. On top of that, 4 penalties. Both of them were very successful in recent memory versus what they've typically looked like. So just from that alone, I think clearly the Hall of Fame game doesn't really matter. It doesn't necessarily indicate anything going forward on its own. I want to also throw this out there because now we start to get into more of this coordinator discussion. I just want to add some context because there are some things that I think are fair to say here, but I want to add some context. First thing being this. When it's brought into the new coordinators and the complaint is that, well, hey, communication and, well, it's coaching, it's scheme. First off, I don't think it's much of scheme in the preseason, right? Certain teams don't do the same thing schematically that they do in the regular season, and obviously you're not as much so preparing for that upcoming opponent like you would in a regular season game. You shouldn't be necessarily. So for saying that it's scheme, I don't think that really is true at all. When you talk about like new coordinators, that's the reason it looks sloppy necessarily. I would also argue that the Lions had a messy first preseason game just a year ago with these coordinators that are absolutely getting all of this praise now that they're no longer Detroit Lions. Now that Ben Johnson's no longer here, now that Aaron Glenn's no longer here, these guys are absolutely loved like across the world, and that's fine. But in 2024, our first preseason game against the Giants, I wouldn't say looked up to standards for what that team was ultimately going to be, winning 15 games, losing that game 3-14 to the New York Giants, 18 of 33 passing ball, giving up 4 sacks. We did run the ball well, 7 penalties in that game. We also turned the ball over. Now, we did force 2 turnovers, but one of those was we threw an interception, and then the returner fumbled the ball on the interception. So I wouldn't say that's the cleanest game. In contrast to the game that we just played, we were 12 of 20, so a 60% completion percentage, similar range, just a lot less passes, only 2 sacks allowed lower, but less attempts. We still ran the ball well, 8 penalties versus 7 penalties, and the biggest difference was 5 turnovers versus 0, which, as Dan Campbell points out, is absolutely the biggest difference. We turned the ball over 5 times. Hard to win games like that, specifically if you're not getting them on the other end.
Another aspect that you guys know I hate is just giving absolutely zero context. When we just call every turnover sloppy, I just don't think that's fair either. Now, I will agree, 2 of the special teams ones were because it's special teams. You shouldn't turn the ball over on a kickoff return, which Grant Stewart did, who hadn't really done that, but it was a new position for him. Regardless, he did fumble. And then you also had the muff punt by Keeney James, who probably won't be in that spot during the regular season. That should be Khalif Raymond. But those are 2, yes, sloppy turnovers. But then you also have an interception in the end zone where he's showing a 2-high look, rolls into single high, and then breaks back to the pylon. It was more so of just a great veteran play by Tony Jefferson. Give credit to a veteran that's been around for a while that had that kind of football intelligence to jump that route that just made a really good jump on the play. And then 2, wide receiver quarterback a little off script, not on the same page on that interception. You also had an out-breaking route that was, again, just a great jump by the cornerback. The ball just really shouldn't have been thrown more so than anything. And then on top of that, you have what ends up being a interception, which was a deep shot down the field by Hendon Hooker that was in his hands. His receiver just didn't catch the ball cleanly, which was something going back to the draft that was noticeable, which turned into a wild interception at the end of the game, right? A deep vertical seam route. So I wouldn't necessarily just categorize all of those as sloppy when you also flip it around and say, well, Trey Lance did muff a snap. It's just that they got back on the ball. And again, so I can add more context to my argument about a first preseason game. Last season, the Lions in their first preseason game, their drives began like this. 5 yards, 8 yards, 0 yards, which was their 3 points because of an interception defensively. 2 yards, 19 yards, 9 yards, 52 yards, which led to an interception on a 4th down play. A couple of those. That's what the Lions offense began like. Again, they scored 3 points, and their points came off of a 0-yard possession. So just to add context, it was pretty horrendous. At least in this game, we created movement. We just turned the ball over twice across the 50. Those drives were not moving the football.
Players that are forcing those, or maybe a schematic presence that leads to a turnover, isn't necessarily as much at hand in a preseason game like it should be in a regular season game. So just to add some context, these guys get all this love, which they should, but the Lions weren't great last year in their first preseason game with all these guys as well. So let's pump the brakes, I believe, on what we're saying here. Now, where I can't agree with this, and I will throw this, or not agree, but I can say this is fair, is what is stated about some of the discipline aspects, because that in the communication, I think that needs to be proven. Because even though it is preseason, you still don't want to have breakdowns, especially for guys that are familiar with guys like Lauren Strickland on the field. Grant Stewart, of course, new addition, so you got some new pieces working together. But we had some real breakdowns in that preseason game. Multiple times the running back was just left completely uncovered. That's not supposed to happen, and it happened multiple times. We also had some early discipline issues with Trevor Nowoski lining up off sides. We had an illegal touching on a punt play. Now, again, some of these flags, like, okay, hands to the face or the pass interference towards the end, like, I'm fine with those. False starts by Jamarco Jones, that happens, right? These are guys trying to battle to get on the team. He makes a bad play. So it's also important to mention who's making these plays. So you had some that I would classify as some of the discipline things like Trevor Nowoski, because he's expected to make the team, and you don't want to have things like that where he's making little mistakes. That is fair, and I do think that some of the communication aspects definitely have to be dialed in. We saw good examples of communication between the safeties. We saw bad examples where guys are literally uncovered. That can happen in regular season too, but we also had that last year with Terrion during the regular season, and it cost us. So that is something I do agree that does need to get cleaned up, and now we can look forward through the preseason and see if those guys do it, because it is new players working amongst each other. Let's see them clean that up now as we work through this preseason, because it is a week earlier than everybody else, so I think it's somewhat understandable, but we do need to get that cleaned up.
What did the Lions do? They didn't just lose 2 coordinators. They lost the talk of the league at offensive coordinator Ben Johnson of the Bears and Aaron Glenn, who somehow got the Lions to a top 10 total defense, despite the fact it was with Band-Aids, Bondo, smoke and mirrors because everybody was hurt.
Thing that's brought up is about our last coordinator, Aaron Glenn, where he says that Aaron Glenn had the Lions at a top 10 total defense last season despite the injuries, which, yeah, shout out to Aaron Glenn. We handled business last season with all the injuries. Now, that didn't mean it was perfect. We played Minnesota really well. We were very aggressive. Darnold made some bad decisions, and we played them really well. We also had some rough games in there, too, where, the injuries, I think, definitely showed, and there were still things in there schematically that I thought was an issue, too. So I think that it's clear, I don't even want to get that nuance to this, but there's things that I didn't like schematically that we did against Washington. There are always things that stylistically that I'm like, I don't really like that we tried that, and that doesn't always mean I'm right, but I did think like the Washington game, I thought we came in with some bad things game plan wise and how we approached them. I didn't think it was just injuries. I thought we could have approached that game differently and had a better strategy, but Washington took advantage. But first off, I don't know what stat he's pointing towards. I assume it's points because most people when they say total defense are just saying total yards. I don't like that stat, but the Lions were 20th in total yards on defense last year, so if he's saying that, it's just not true. Secondly, he's probably saying points. We were 7th there, so that is true, but why is that the case? Well, this is kind of back to the fair point of, and we'll have to see how it plays out because we don't know right now, the Lions were very good situationally. They were really good on third down, and they were really good in the red zone.
And now look, each game I typically have a different perspective on than seemingly most people do, so I just don't think I'm going to look at a lot of these scores like most would. But the Lions did, over the last 7 games of the season, allow 29 points per game, which would definitely not be top 10. But to be fair to that, you have games like San Francisco where we give up 34, where I felt that we made some good adjustments. Kirby made some big plays, got us off the field, won that game. I thought we played better towards the end. Or games like, for example, Chicago, that you look at that when they scored 20 points, they didn't score in the first half. They were shut out, but in the second half, they essentially scored every possession but one, and then they had a sloppy finish, which allowed them to not get points at the end of that game, which helped us hold on for the win. And then we can go back even further. So again, I have different perspective on a lot of these, but the point is, we allowed 29 points per game over our last 7. That's not a top 10 scoring defense at that time.
Usually with Aaron Glenn, they weren't always, right? They had their bad moments, but they were really good there. And typically, to me, I always thought it started with, first off, the Lions had the defensive backs for that. They were very difficult to score on inside the 20 because they were interchangeable at defensive back. Their linebackers were good in coverage, specifically Alex Anzalone. And then, of course, you had a playmaker in Hutchinson that if you had him in a passing situation in that spot, he would shut down drives on his own. So you were great on third down. You were a heavy blitzing team that created a ton of pressure, and you have guys that like to disrupt at the line of scrimmage. So you had a scheme, you had a formula to make it work, and I think the Lions showed that. Now, that didn't mean it always showed up. I remember we had a play where we dropped the linebacker onto the first down marker, and he ends up just flying by the linebacker, doesn't really make a play, and we still end up giving up a first down. We were in a spot to get off the field, and we didn't. In situations, we were really bad in that game, but typically we were really good situationally, so our defense thrived because of that.
Also, again, now we're getting a little more nuance, but player freedom on the field, that has to come with player development and experience over time, right? Young guys becoming the veterans of the team, right? Our draft picks becoming the vets. When we had a play where Aiden Hutchinson jumps inside because he calls a stunt on the field, and Aaron Glenn tells us afterward, like, hey, we're giving them that freedom. And that's an area where guys are just going to grow over time because they're working into those roles. That's not something that's going to show up in year 1 of Aaron Glenn, but by year 4, maybe you start to see more of those elements pop. But again, those are much more nuanced elements than this conversation that's being had in this clip.
I'm not going to make any claims off of this Hall of Fame game, whether or not the Lions are situationally going to be good, because I just don't think that's fair at all. It's offense in this game. We're 1 of 11 on third down. So defensively, 4 of 13. That's solid, but the 2 of 2 that was allowed on fourth downs isn't great. So situationally, they were just kind of average, I think, in this game defensively. But anyways, that's not something I'm really going to be able to gather, I think, from that preseason game.
Lost 2 great coordinators. And did they do a league-wide search to replace them? No. One guy on staff elevated him. Another guy formerly on staff, they went and got him. They chose comfort. That's what they chose.
This, to me, is my least favorite part of the clip because I think this is the worst reasoning that's used in this video. I think this could be a case because if there was, first off, data that backed this up. And if you show me that data, then maybe I could agree with this. But I wasn't able to find that by looking at recent history, that there was any sort of correlation between, hey, you hired a guy within house versus out of house. Oh, that's going to fail. Like, there was no correlation anywhere there. It typically came back to the head coach, which he makes the point on of scheme guys, which we'll talk about here in a second. And Dan Campbell's never thrown into that category for whatever reason. We'll get to that though in a second. The point is that reasoning, whatever, I don't think it's backed up by anything. It's just the only evidence is it's hard to find good coaches. And typically you go through different coordinators. That's just how it works. They're hard to find guys that you really like. But the idea of, first off, that Dan Campbell's just hiring guys off for comfort, one, I would say that just isn't fair, because that's never been Dan Campbell's mantra since he's got here. He's the guy that got here and told us that he was going to hire who he felt was the best candidate, and that he wasn't going to hire a guy just because, we had a relationship before. That said, though, if you want to say, well, he did it anyway because look at who he hired, that's fine. The examples that he used are absolute garbage, because he's literally explaining our last coordinators. He says the first thing that he brings up is this, that the Lions promoted a guy within house, elevated a guy that was on the staff, right, as a bad thing. Oh, you elevated a guy on a staff. Yeah, Kelvin Shepard was elevated to defensive coordinator from linebacker coach. However, let's also keep in mind that that was Ben Johnson. Ben Johnson was here before Dan Campbell got here. Ben Johnson was a quality control coach. Ben Johnson was a tight end coach. Ben Johnson was promoted to our offensive coordinator in 2022. After, and how did that role become available? He fired the guy that was an out-of-house option.
And also, again, as a side note, it's not like the Lions didn't interview anybody. I'm not going to say they went out and interviewed everybody, but they did interview, and they had players or people in for interviews that were out-of-house options.
Elevated a guy that was on the staff, right, as a bad thing. Oh, you elevated a guy on a staff. Yeah, Kelvin Shepard was elevated to defensive coordinator from linebacker coach. However, let's also keep in mind that that was Ben Johnson. Ben Johnson was here before Dan Campbell got here. Ben Johnson was a quality control coach. Ben Johnson was a tight end coach. Ben Johnson was promoted to our offensive coordinator in 2022. After, and how did that role become available? He fired the guy that was an out-of-house option. The guy that he brought in that he didn't have that connection, which was Anthony Lynn, that through the season he fired. And by the way, it wasn't that Ben took over play calling, pass game coordinator. It was Dan Campbell that took over the play calling through the season, which to me just completely overrides most of the idea that it's just like Dan Campbell's just sitting there and kind of closing his eyes and just hiring guys and hoping they do a good job, and not as much so as like, hey, this is still how Dan's vision is. Like, I give a lot of love to Ben and Aaron Glenn, but let's also still give credit to Dan Campbell. Like, just because we don't want to label him as a scheme guy, I don't think that's fair, because he did call plays and he did have the offense look the way that he wanted to, and that's not the only example of it. As I pointed out before, he did the same thing with Miami as an interim head coach, fired their OC at the time, made the offense look different. He wanted to run the ball more. He had a vision of what he wanted to look like, and he got it that way by firing the offense coordinator. He did the same thing with us. And then the next example that he brings up, which again is a very poor example because he's laying right into what we'd have done, is he said that the next hiring they made is a formerly on staff, which is John Morton as our offense coordinator. He was on the staff for 1 year a couple of years ago. However, that is literally Aaron Glenn, who was formerly on the staff with Dan Campbell when he took the position. Aaron Glenn was a defensive backs coach for the New Orleans Saints, as Dan Campbell was the assistant head coach, and he brought him from New Orleans and elevated him into the defensive coordinator role.
And again, as a little side note here, Tanner Engstrand could have also been, I guess, even a safer hire, I guess, or yeah, by what he's saying here, because Tanner Engstrand was a guy that was already in-house and was already our pass game coordinator. We could have just elevated him, but instead we chose to go a different route and add Johnny Morton, which has much less connections, as we're going to touch on here in a second. So just thought I'd add that idea as well.
That's literally the exact same thing, or maybe not the exact same, but it's essentially the same thing, right? You're talking about a former staff member now becoming the DC from a role that he didn't have before, right? You're elevating to that role. That's what Aaron Glenn was. Spent less time with Dan, just a single season, so I feel like this almost does feel like an out-of-house option. But the other aspect of that, he's actually been an offensive coordinator before. Aaron Glenn had never done it before. So I think the argument doesn't make any sense, because you're essentially just explaining what we did again this time around. It's just that I don't see, throw me the data that says, hey, look, you hired him in-house, that's terrible, versus out-of-house option. I think everybody's individually unique, and I think the fact that, if you can show me that data, that's fine, but ultimately I don't think that's a strong argument on its own. That's just sound. It's just like me saying, like, oh, hey, you have a better chance of missing on your next coordinator than hitting because you hired him out-of-house. Like, yeah, that's an easy argument to make, because, yes, you typically are missing on your coordinators. It just, the statistics bear that out, right? That's how it typically goes, regardless of what his background is. So I just don't like that as the reasoning. I feel like that doesn't make any sense, and it literally just explains our current situation.
Sirianni and Campbell are very coordinator dependent. They're not scheme guys like McVay or Reed or Shanahan.
But let's build on that, because then he starts to talk about how, well, Dan Campbell's not a scheme guy. These other guys are scheme guys. I don't like the examples that he gives, and I've already given this video, so I don't want to spend too much time here. Bring up Andy Reid, for example, and obviously they're fantastic. But to then say, like, okay, it just doesn't matter with the coordinators. Well, let's focus on this. Why then, after Eric Bieniemy is no longer there, the last 2 seasons with Matt Nagy, they are the 15th ranked offense by his metric, which is points, versus when Eric Bieniemy was there, they were first. You're going to tell me, well, it's personnel differences. Okay, then why are we focused so much on just the coordinator spot here? Just kind of like, oh, sprinkling, well, there's some personnel changes. I still trust Brad Holmes in the roster. You just sprinkle that in at the end. But that's the argument that you would give me for Kansas City. I've made the same argument before for other teams as well, or when I did the little thing with TD, which was great. That was a lot of fun. But that's that argument, okay? I can just spin it around. Or the idea of like, oh, Sean McVay. Hey, Sean McVay. Well, I would actually point more to the defense side, because when I ask him what does Sean McVay represent, he would say the offense. He would talk about that. He would talk nothing about the defense. But the aspect of Sean McVay is, well, their defensive coordinator is now going to his next year as their defense coordinator that they had to replace. And I wouldn't say that they necessarily improved, but they stabilized it enough to keep him around. That's actually the more impressive aspect, because that's not necessarily what you're pointing out. When you're talking about coordinators, there's 2 sides of the ball here that you have to get right, and he was able to do that. Or Sean McDermott, be able to do that with the offense and recognize that and be able to find the right piece for Josh Allen, even though he's not recognized as a scheme guy on that side of the ball. Let's go to the best head coaches in football, and then everything else is bad, because the only argument that gets flipped around, that constantly gets flipped, is now let's look at, let's compare the Lions to Philadelphia. Well, first off, he believes that Philadelphia is one of the 5 teams in a Super Bowl bubble this season. But the second aspect of that, just because they replaced both coordinators, they did that this year too. They replaced both coordinators again this year too. Why aren't we giving them the same concern? Right? Like, why is there not the same concern of like, well, they just did that again? Because while it imploded a couple of years ago, right, it did towards second half of the season. It was ugly, at least on one side of the ball, truly. And then obviously defense was nowhere near as good as when Fangio came in. It was really bad. And then they hired 2 new coordinators and they got it right again. But that means that they had a 50% hit rate between those two different seasons. Why is it more of a 50-50 shot that, well, if they missed on coordinators again, this could be a problem, versus just assuming that they're a top 5 team? Well, because of the roster. Kind of pick and choose when we want things to make sense. Dan Campbell doesn't have to be viewed as a scheme guy. That's fine. But I don't think it's fair to also not consider Dan Campbell's like, this is Dan Campbell's vision of how this is going to look, because I think that's been evidently clear that it is Dan Campbell's vision. That's why he's fired coaches during the season. That's why he was able to recognize, Aubrey Pleasant, defensive backs coach, had a really strong track record. Not someone that I personally had connection with out of house option, but did really well elsewhere. We fired him during the season, right? We made those changes. We've done this obviously with positional coaches all over the place, and things got better. That doesn't mean it always works, but we've done a lot of changing of positional coaches. But just from coordinators alone, he literally took over play calling for us, right? This guy has a vision of what he wants to look like. Now, that doesn't mean the coordinators aren't doing anything, right? Because they obviously are, and you have to hit on that. But also, let's not act like Dan Campbell's blindly just throwing things at a wall. Like, I'm comfy with you, you got it. That's not fair to do to Dan Campbell when he has led this thing up to this point, and his vision has been the leading fact of how the Lions have played the game of football. Like, you'll give Nick Sirianni the credit for the tush push. Why don't you give Dan Campbell the credit for the aggressiveness on 4th down that allows us to play a certain way with our high conversion rate on 4th down, right? Because now we're the most aggressive team in football, right? Why doesn't he get credit for that?
There's a lot of double-sidedness to what's being said here about Philadelphia and Nick Sirianni, because on one hand, it's like, well, the coordinators, they got it wrong. And look, the Lions could do the exact same thing here. But in the exact same show earlier that day, he's telling us how, well, I've changed my mind on Nick Sirianni. I believe in Nick Sirianni now because he wins a lot and he gets his team to play well, whatever I thought about him. Okay, well, let's not completely flip our perspective just because now they had it right the most recently, when just a year ago it was all these concerns about Nick Sirianni. I don't know if he can do it. He's so reliant on his coordinators. I just feel like there's a very heavy double-sidedness to this.
Yeah, I'll grade the tape. Let's start with a D- and work our way from there.
And I also don't like the element at the end that's just thrown in as like just throw it as a D-, because first off, I just think that throws out the window the entire point of the preseason. Obviously, from a team perspective, you want to win, you're playing as a group, but in reality, that's not what preseason is going to lead to, right? It's not like, hey, you won all your preseason games, everybody that played, you made the team, congrats. Like, no, You can say we do it as a team, but that's not how it's going to work. There's going to be a few of you guys that maybe make the team, and some of you will stick around in the practice squad. And then everybody else is auditioning for somebody somewhere else. That's not what the preseason represents, right? Let's not act like our rookie draft picks didn't play well. Achman was maybe our best performer, a rookie draft pick. Tuslak clearly showed out, rookie draft pick. Lovett had some up and down. We could talk about that, but Lovett had some production clearly in that game. I thought Dan Jackson was good. Unfortunately, now he's knocked out for the season, but that's the other element that I just don't like here. It's not like everybody was terrible in this game, because that's just not true at all. You know, there was multiple interior offensive linemen that did well. Again, we're just taking this as 34-7. That's trash, because that's not the preseason. There's a reason these records don't count, because that doesn't matter, right? That's not what the preseason's about. It's about competing for roster spots, right? Which guys are going to shine. You do it as a group, you do it as a team, but ultimately not everybody's going to make it just because you win that football game.
And again, I would have preferred, even though I don't completely agree with this either, if the argument was, man, the Lions are in trouble at backup quarterback. Hendon Hooker and Kyle Allen are not going to get it done. That's a concern for the Lions. I'm fine with that being somebody's case, but that's not the case that's being made here. You're just saying D-. I don't like that. And again, I don't completely back that as a whole anyway. Last year it was Nate Sudfeld and it was Hendon Hooker still, so I wouldn't like that argument either. But if that was your argument, that's fine, but that's not what we're saying.
Aspect of what he touches on of like, hey, the defense was top 10 last season. Look, this dude has constantly said during the year that the only reason the defense was that good is not because they're good defensively because of all the injuries. They were all down on it, but it was instead because the offense would score so many points. So don't make it convenient for yourself when it just makes sense to throw it in your direction. I get what you're doing, but I just think that's just you making it convenient for yourself. Now all of a sudden he's amazing versus at the time it was like, well, it's actually the offense building up such a big lead, which there may be truth to that. But at the same time, let's not just make it convenient for when it makes sense, because truthfully, that's what happened in the Washington game. If we score on that drive where Graham Glasgow gives us the sack fumble, or we don't fumble there and we score a touchdown, that game's probably way different than what it turns out to be because you're playing with a lead. So there's truth to that. But let's not make it convenient for the case of, well, actually, the defense was fantastic with Aaron Glenn. He just made it work. When in reality, you weren't spraying that towards the end of this past season. It's not necessarily this show or this segment, but it's more so just the idea that I hear all the time, and I just want to give some perspective from my perspective. With that being said, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you, Brett, for watching.